All right, so what I'm going to discuss, this is supply day 2. We went over this today, okay? So this is going to be your shifts in the supply curve, and these are all the factors that might affect your shifts or, your variables that would affect your supply if you were a producer or in the market. So I'm going to start here. I don't really go over the warm-ups. So what is a change in supply? That's an increase in supply, means that at every price, the quantity supplied has increased. A decrease in supply means that at every price, the quantity supplied has decreased. So you have your increase means that your supply goes up, and a decrease in supply means that your quantity also decreases. I know that's kind of confusing there, but it's both affected by price. Okay. What does a change in supply look like? That means an increase in supply means the entire curve shifts to the right, whereas a decrease in supply means the entire curve shifts to the left. And this is an example of that. On your notes, what you're going to do is you're going to have to move your little pieces here, okay, which you're going to have an S1 and S2, S2 and S1, and then some arrows. Now, what you need to know about this is that your S1, that is your past supply line, okay? And then your S2 is your current supply. So your old supply and your new supply. And notice that if you have, an increase means that your curve is going to shift to the right. A decrease in supply means that your curve shifts to the left. So what is the difference between changes in supply and changes in quantity supplied graphically? Remember, a change in quantity supplied means movement along one supply curve due to a change in price only. A change in supply from a non-price factor shifts the entire curve to the left. Okay, so if you are back and you were looking along your supply curve, okay, it's kind of a curve. Sometimes it's not really a curve, but so if you were looking along your curve, it says a change in quantity supplied means movement along one supply curve due to a change in price only. So that means that in some of these instances, that your change in supply would just be affected by your price. However, it says that a change in supply from a non-price factor shifts the entire curve itself. So price only means that you are just looking at your your line here. You're just looking here to see your increase in supply. However, if a non-price factor has affected your business production, the whole curve itself moves. So in one instance, we're just looking at movement along the curve. But if you have an outside variable that goes up, something that is not a fixed amount, okay? Let's say that one of your ingredients to your product goes up. That means that your entire curve is going to affect all of your production and your prices, which means the entire curve shifts to the right because, you might be able to produce more or less. Now, if that item is a scarce item or there's a shortage on it and you can't produce enough or you can't produce enough of your product, the curve shifts to the left because, like we said, it affects the entire line or the entire curve. It does not only, it's not just the price we're looking at, okay? So what causes a change in the entire supply curve? You have factors other than a change in price. Those are non-price factors. Factors include changes in the cost of inputs, the number of sellers, the market due to natural disasters or international events, technology, producer expectations, and then also government policies or regulations. So the first thing here, changes in the cost of inputs. What are inputs? So if you look at that bag of potato chips to the right, it kind of very strongly favors Lay's potato chips, but of course of copyright infringement, they could not put that there. Inputs, your factors of production, your land, labor, your capital. Remember, capital is your human capital and your physical capital. Those things producers must pay for to make their good or service. So for example, if I wanted to look up, all right, so if I wanted to look up the ingredients to brownies, for example, okay, so you have your inputs. Those are your factors of production, and these are not including labor, your production costs, distribution. We're just looking at kind of your land. We're going to categorize this as land, and also maybe some of your physical resource, your physical capital will go into this. So you got chocolate, eggs, butter, sugar, flour, cocoa, you said chocolate. If you are making your own brownie company and you're producing brownies, you don't make chocolate. That's not something that you have. So that means that you will receive or you purchase chocolate from another distributor. Same thing with eggs, unless you're just going up to Walmart every day and getting you some eggs. But still, you don't have that on hand. So if you're a brownie company, you are limited by the availability of these items. Okay, so these are your inputs. You're going to have more, but these are just some examples. Flour. If there was ever a shortage on flour, that means that you would not be able to produce as many brownies as you normally did. And this would also probably affect the price of your brownies because you would have to pay more for an item that was scarce or there was a shortage of. Okay, so moving back, let me move my slide back over. So, for example, making chips, some inputs would be the packaging, the factory costs. I don't know chips that have cornmeal, but we're going to say potatoes, okay? You also probably would have to pay for salt and whatever seasoning you put on your chips. How can the cost of inputs shift the supply curve? The cost of one or multiple inputs decreases, so the supply curve shifts to the right. So that is an example of how the curve would increase or how the supply would increase. So now remember we said that these variables here, since they can change, this would mean the entire curve itself would move to the right or the left because it's not looking at just your fixed price. It's looking at the entire, how it would affect your supply. Okay, so I went too far. So if you had an increase in supply, an example of that means that your supply curve would shift to the right. If you had a decrease in your supply or a decrease in the cost of inputs, that means that the cost of one or multiple inputs increases, so the supply curve will shift to the left. So let's say that you are a brownie maker and you want to make your brownies, but the cost of flour has increased. That means that you as a business owner are going to have to pay for that because that's the main ingredient of your brownies. You're going to have to lose, either raise your prices or lower your supply. Okay? So that means that your curve would shift to the left. So this would be your decrease in supply. The entire curve would shift to the left because you can no longer supply or make the entire amount of brownies that you normally did because the price of flour has gone up. How does the number of sellers affect the supply curve? For example, if there were to increase. So if the sellers would affect the supply curve, if there was an increase, that means an increase in the number of sellers results in an increase in the supply curve, which is a shift to the right because there's more sellers, there's more things being made. For example, when White Castle first opened its doors in the 1920s, it revolutionized eating or eating out by providing fast food. Now there are many, many fast food sellers that have entered the market. All right, now if you were to look at a decrease, okay, if the number of sellers within the fast food market decreased, that means that there is a decrease in the number of sellers and it has resulted in a decrease in the supply curve, which means there are not as many fast food options available. Fast food, that means that your supply would shift to the left because there is a decrease in the amount of fast food that is available. We were talking earlier about how Burger King is kind of already on its last leg. So, I mean, if ever people stop buying fast food, okay, if people stop buying fast food, how would that affect the number of sellers in the market for fast food? That means that some of these businesses would have to go out because they wouldn't be able to make up for it. I mean, Chick-fil-A probably is always going to do fine. But think about some of these smaller fast food restaurants. They probably would not be able to maintain their company because the demand for fast food would go down. Okay, and so how would that affect the supply curve? It means the supply curve would shift to the left. There's just not as many people or not as much fast food being produced. All right, changes in the market due to natural disasters or international events. What are some examples of natural disasters and international events? For example, you've got your tornadoes, your hurricanes, severe weather changes, earthquakes, floods, wildfires, etc. You also have international events like free trade agreements, wars, revolutions. You even have the pandemic. That's a big issue. How do these affect the supply curve? Natural disasters might destroy the supply of a good, which shift the supply curve to the left. Imagine if there was a hurricane or tornado. For example, if you're a farmer and you are producing cotton, or if you are producing corn, just any kind of major agricultural product, okay? We'll say cotton, for example. If you're producing cotton and a tornado or a hurricane comes and it hits and wipes out your farm, and let's say you were a pretty major farmer and you really made your money off of farming, any of these businesses in the local area or even out of the state that actually counted on your cotton to be used in their textiles, their clothing, to produce the clothing or to produce other things, if they didn't have access to your product because it was taken out from a natural disaster, that means that the supply curve is going to shift to the left because their supply is gone or it's limited. Okay. Another example, if an especially cold winter destroys orange trees, the supply of oranges decrease, which means that these other places would also, you couldn't supply as many oranges because they're just not there. International events also might restrict or increase the trade and supply of a good depending on the event. Now, a war might increase the supply of weapons. If you think back to World War II, that was really one of the main ways that got people, back out into the factories and working again from the Great Depression, was because they gave them a job. And the main thing that they were supplying or producing was war weapons. Another issue you could consider, though, on the downside to that is the pandemic. Because of the pandemic, a lot of trade has been halted. People had to wait for 2 weeks while something was quarantined before they could actually take it out of the big shipping containers and then send it out to whoever it was supposed to go to. So that means it put a big delay time on those producers and their businesses. So we went over that one. Changes in technology. How does a change in technology affect supply? Changes or advancements in technology usually shift the supply curve to the right because technology lowers the cost of input by replacing human laborers with machines. So one of the biggest factors for an employer is they have to pay for labor. Now, depending on the cost of labor and the regulations involved, like in the United States, we have minimum wage, which means that a worker is guaranteed a certain amount of money per hour. In other countries, that does not exist. And that is where you will have a lot of these companies who will outsource their production to other countries, for example, China, because labor costs are so much cheaper. Another thing that what you're going to see now is that some of these, simpler jobs where you're really not using a lot of brain power, it's just kind of like a task. Okay, so example, checkout lines. Okay, if you're at Target, Walmart, etc., grocery stores, you see a lot more now of the self-checkout lines. And that means that these businesses have installed these self-checkout lines because they know that a lot of these people can probably do it themselves. They can check out on their own. Now, you might have one employee kind of standing there and monitoring everything. But if they don't have to pay as many workers to ring up the items and, check out the customers, that means they get to keep more money in their pocket that they can use other places to produce other things. So another example here, it says fast food companies replacing humans who take your order with kiosk machines where you place your own order. And that actually happens up in the north or even in other countries. Some of these fast food places will just have a big kiosk there, kind of like, those big old Coke machines where you've got like 50 choices of things and you just press the button. But this is an example. You'll go up, you'll, place your order, you'll pay for it. And then somebody will just bring, say your order's up at the counter, you'll go get it. And you've never once probably interacted with a person the entire time. But that means it's cheaper costs for the producer. Changes in producer expectations. How does a change in producer expectations affect supply? For example, increase. If producers expect that prices will fall in the future, they will put more of their product on the market today before the prices fall. Now, a decrease in this situation, if producers expect that prices will rise in the future, they will put more of their product into storage and put it back on the market when prices go back up because they want to make as much money as possible on their good or service that they're selling. So that means that they sometimes will stockpile that item, and then once the prices regulate or go back up, then they'll sell their item again because they make more money on their return on their investment. And the last slide, changes in government policies and regulations. What types of government policies and regulations affect suppliers? Subsidies, when the government gives money directly to a business so that they can function. You also have excise taxes, which is a tax on a specific good. And the question says, how do these government actions affect the supply curve? Subsidies can increase supply by allowing producers to make more goods with the government money, or the government might be paying them to produce less. And I'll show you some examples of government subsidies. All right, so for example, it says, what are examples? This is what I'm looking for so I can tell you specifically some examples of government subsidies. So they have farm, oil, export, etc. So what are the major federal government subsidies? So it says a subsidy is a cash grant or loan that the government gives to businesses. It encourages activities the government wishes to promote. Now, if you were Adam Smith, you would be totally against this because he believed that the market would regulate itself through an invisible hand, which is self-interest. He doesn't believe that the government should be involved in the economy in any way. So one level of government can also give subsidies to another. This includes federal grants given to state or local governments and state grants given to municipal governments. So for example, like the city of Tuscaloosa. The World Trade Organization has a broader definition of subsidies. It says a subsidy is any financial benefit provided by a government which gives an unfair advantage to a specific industry, business, or even an individual. The World Trade Organization mentions 5 types of subsidies. Cash subsidies, such as the grants mentioned above, tax concessions, such as exemptions, credits, or deferrals, assumption of risk, such as loan guarantees, government procurement policies that pay more than the free market price, or stock purchases that keep a company's stock price higher than market levels. These are all considered subsidies because they reduce the cost of doing business. And this says many experts argue that U.S. farms don't even need subsidies. They're located in one of the most favorable geographic regions in the world. It has rich soil, abundant rainfall, access to rivers. It says, but America's food supply must be protected from droughts, tornadoes, and recessions. The price system lasted until the 1990s. Now it says the federal government guaranteed farmers a high enough price to remain profitable. It paid farmers to make sure supply did not exceed demand. So this is an example here of the government. Let me drag my thing. This is an example of the government affecting the supply curve. They are paying farmers not to farm, so there's not an overproduction of goods. Moving back, we don't care about that on the side. Okay, so there's another example, oil. In March 2012, President Obama called for an end to the $4 billion in oil industry subsidies. Some estimates indicated that the real level of oil industry subsidies is higher, between $10 and $40 billion. It goes on to say, here's the summary of the 2011 oil industry subsidies compiled by taxpayers for common sense. So these are all taxpayer dollars that go towards oil, the oil industry, which is a private business, a private company. Okay, or these are private companies. Greenpeace argues that the oil industry subsidies should also include the following activities. Okay, we also have ethanol subsidies, gasoline, okay. Housing subsidies, this is a big one. Housing subsidies promote home ownership and support the construction industry. They total about $15 billion a year. Housing subsidies come in 2 forms, interest rate subsidies and down payment assistance. The biggest interest rate subsidy is the mortgage interest deduction on the federal income tax. So if you have ever had, when you become a homeowner, you are able to put this on your taxes and you get money back. There are also some smaller interest subsidies that reduce mortgage costs for low-income families. It says that the federal government also matches the amount low-income families save for a down payment. This came to $10.9 million in 2008. You have other subsidies. For example, Cash for Clunkers program was a subsidy to auto dealers according to the BEA. The program dealers receive a subsidy of up to $4,500 from the federal government after discounting a new vehicle to a consumer who traded in an old car. You also have Obamacare subsidies. They're designed to go to middle-income families. It says 10.6 million Americans were eligible for subsidies in February of 2018. Most didn't get them because they didn't sign up for insurance on the exchanges. The bottom line And any financial benefit, whether cash or tax cuts given by the government to the businesses or government organizations, is considered a subsidy. Subsidies are given to help companies reduce their cost of doing business. In doing so, the government itself is affecting the market. They help boost certain sectoral activities for the economy. So they're very selective in what industries they are trying to help or honestly potentially hurt. Now, this is a quick graph that I wanted to show before we finish. Okay, so this should play. I wonder if we can even read the handwriting here.
Short video showing how we demonstrate an increase in supply on our supply and demand graph. An increase in supply is a downward shift or a rightward shift. And so think of holding price constant. The quantity supplied on this supply curve would be, say, 5. But at the same price, the quantity supplied after an increase in supply would be 10. So use this little price check to make sure you shift your supply in the right direction. An increase in supply is a downward shift. A decrease in supply is an upward shift or a leftward shift. So do that same price trick. If the price is the same, here quantity supplied might be 1. So an increase in supply goes down, downward shift, decrease in supply, upward shift. So what could cause an increase in supply? Well, it's a change in one of the determinants of supply. So input prices could go down, that would cause an increase in supply. Productivity or technology could go up, an increase in supply. Price of a substitute could change. So if the price of a substitute goes down, that would increase supply. The number of firms could increase, which would increase supply, and the expected future price could drop, which would also increase supply because they'd want to sell those goods now at the higher price. So remember which direction the supply curve shifts. It's kind of counterintuitive. An increase in supply is a downward shift, and likewise, a decrease in supply is an upward shift.
Sometimes you need to get away from the...
And that is, let me go back. Those are all things. This is just another example kind of showing you how and what will affect the supply curve. Okay. The only thing I think I didn't talk about off this slide, excise taxes. They usually decrease the supply of a good since they add to the cost of input for sellers. For example, excise taxes on cigarettes. And that is everything for our part 2 section of notes.